Hello and welcome back. In the last video, we learned how to place tiles onto a grid based off which edge the tile is placed on, or if it is a non-edge tile. We also made it work based off the orthographic size of the camera, which I do not believe I've actually showed off in any of the videos, so I'll go ahead and show it off now. Putting it to 10 doubles the size. We can even pump it up to, let's go up to 50 and see if it can handle that. It's taking it a second to load, but it loaded. We have a crap ton of objects. 199 by 99. That is a lot of objects. Alright, anyways, in this video, we will be learning how to use scriptable objects to determine the theme of the tiles that we have on the screen and updating them in real time. So let's reset our screen size back to 5. The first thing we're going to want to do is go into our grid manager script. We are going to first organize some things. We will be taking all of this and putting it into a function called setupGrid, just to make it cleaner so we know what each chunk of code is actually doing. We will now run setupGrid within start. We are going to move vertical, horizontal, columns, rows to a utils class so we can easily access them from any other class. This will be a static C# class. Going back into back into our Unity project, waiting for it to compile, let's create a scripts folder. Drag your script into it. Create a new script, we'll call it utils. Open the utils script. Now within this script, we'll reopen your grid manager script. We're going to take these variables and move it into utils. Remove the mono behavior and make this a public static class. And these will be public static ints. Get rid of the start and the update. We can now access vertical, horizontal, columns, and rows from any class by saying utils.vertical and so on. We will now remove these from here and fix the errors. We're going to move our grid to world position into our utils class so we can easily get the grid to world position in any file. Make this a public static. We'll also move this to the utils file and rename it to getTile. Also making it public and static. Go back into here, change this to utils.getTile. Now that we have our file more organized, let's save everything, go back into Unity and just click play to make sure nothing is broken. Everything still works as expected, so to set up our grid to use a scriptable object as the theme instead of this array of sprites, we will create a new scriptable object class and call it TileTheme. TileTheme object, actually. I usually put the word object on any class that references a scriptable object to make it more organized and consistent. You can also create a scriptable folders class inside of here to store the scripts for the scriptable object. Let's open our TileTheme object, change your mono behavior to be a scriptable object, get rid of the functions that are added at the beginning. We will go above the public class, add a bracket, and now say create asset menu. We will set the file name of our asset to be new tile theme And now the menu name is going to be, menu name is tiles/theme. Now when you right click, go to tiles and then click on theme, it will create a new tile theme object. On the tile theme object, it will just be an array of sprites. And I'll call it tiles. Now going back into our grid manager, we can get rid of the sprites variable and change it to say public tile theme object, make it an array of themes so we can have more than one theme. We will now be creating a class to hold each grid position and what is on that position of the grid. So this will be moved into that class. So for now we will line it out, and all we need in here is as followed. And now that this is just one line of code, we can actually remove the brackets from these for loops to make this code cleaner. Compile your code to make sure you have no errors. Now let's create a class to store each position of the grid. We will call this class cell. Going into the cell class, we are actually going to not be using a class, and it's going to be a struct because structs are more easily accessed within memory and are stored better. So if you can get away with using a struct and you're just storing and retrieving data, it is best to use a struct. But in some situations you will get weird errors where the struct will not work, and if you do not know the finer details of the difference between a struct and a class, and you're not able to figure out why your project is not working, simply switch your struct to a class and see if that fixes it. But on our struct, we will be having a game object which will store the game object in the world that this grid is referencing. So when we spawn a cell, that cell will also instantiate a tile prefab into the world and then store a reference to that tile prefab within this game object. We will also store a reference to the sprite renderer so we do not have to find it through the game object every time we need to access it. The cell also needs to know its X and Y positions. We'll use a capital X and a capital Y. You may want to use a lowercase instead, but I'm going to use a capital. Now by saying public cell, this will be every time you say new cell, this function will call and anything within this function will happen. If you look, it says cell.y must fully be assigned before control is returned to the caller. This is saying that all of these variables need to be set up within this function before it can work. It just your project's not even going to run unless you do this. So let's set up some variables in here. We'll use a game object for the prefab that we'll be instantiating, a sprite for the sprite that we'll be placing on the sprite renderer, the intx and the inty for the grid location. Now we'll say x equals x, y equals y, game object equals we'll have to say game object dot instantiate prefab utils dot get grid or grid to world position x y, and then a rotation of 0 using quaternion.identity. Now we need to set up the renderer, which is GameObject.getComponent sprite renderer. We can now set the name of our game object like we were doing before to be the X and the Y of the grid position so we can easily reference it inside the hierarchy. Because how we're setting this up, it's not going to be easily serializable within Unity. You're going to be needing to use breakpoints and the Visual Studio's debugging because of Unity's inability to serialize a 2D array. So it's easier to, while debugging, to have the GameObject's name set up to the X and Y position. But later, when you want to release your project, it's better to take this out because accessing the name and changing the name is a lot more performance than you're probably thinking it is. Anyways, continuing on. Then we'll set the renderer sprite to the sprite. Now when we create a new cell, a GameObject will instantiate, create a name giving it the cell position, and setting the sprite to the sprite of the cell's sprite variable that we set up when it was constructed. We'll go ahead and create a function for updating the renderer's tile also. We'll call it public void update tile. And it's going to need a sprite for the sprite that we're updating with, and then we'll simply say renderer.sprite equals sprite. Alright, now the next thing we need to do, we have our cell set up, we have the tile theme object set up, we have our utils set up. Now let's go back to the grid manager. We can erase this because now when we create a new cell, it spawns the tile in when we say new cell. So let's see what we need to do. Instead of our grid storing in float, we actually need it to be an array of cells. So we'll change this to say cell, and then right here it's going to say new cell. And then instead of it being a random range, it's going to be a new cell. This new cell is going to need the tile prefab that we set up. And now we also need a variable to store the theme that we are currently on. So we'll make an int called current theme. We'll use current theme to access the themes array. And then we'll get the tile off of that theme, and the tile on that theme that we want will be utils.getTile ij. Now we need to push the X and the Y position, which is just I and J. Alright, now every time new cell is called, it will instantiate a new tile at the position because we have all of that set up here. So all we need to do is call new tile and pass the values. Now, if we want to update these tiles, we're going to use a void. I would go ahead and test this code, but until we have it all done, it's not really going to make any visual difference. If we went and tested it now, we'd have to go ahead and set up our scriptable object, and that's going to take a second because we have to drag the 9 objects in, and we only have a little bit of code left to write, so let's just finish these last 2 functions that we have to set up, and then we'll go back into Unity and do the rest of what we have to do. So we'll have a void called update tile theme. And then we need an index because that's the index will be the theme that we want. We'll say current theme equals index. And then we'll do a for loop through the i's, through the utils.columns. Then we'll do a for loop using j. And if you're wondering how I'm auto-writing my for loops, if you type for, then hit tab twice, it will auto-type the for loop, and then you can just click tab to switch between the variables within your for loop. And when you're done setting your for loop up, you can click enter, and it'll go to the middle of your for loop. Now, the only thing this for loop needs to do is grid the I and the j. You could also use XY, but sometimes we use XY as variables up here, so I like to use I and j on the for loops and X and Y's within the variables in the function call. It's just, you'll find your own ways of doing things and things that are more comfortable for you. If you want to follow mine, then that's fine, but whatever is comfortable for you. Anyways, we'll update our tile with the function that we set up within the cell, and the sprite that we want to pass is going to be themes, the current theme, the tile, and then we need to say utils, the exact same thing that we wrote when we set up the grid, utils.getTile ij. We can get rid of these brackets to make our code look cleaner. Now let's set up a key down for actually switching the theme that we are using. It's just going to be input.getKeyDown. The key we'll use is the space button, so keycode.space. And then it'll just say update tile theme. And then the index that we want, it's going to be current theme is less than themes.length -1. And now you're probably wondering what I'm doing. Like, this isn't an if. What are you doing? You can't make a call like this inside of a function. Well, actually you can. There's a way to do this in one line. If you put a question mark after it, it's saying that if this is true, we will fire whatever's right here, and then you can put a colon, and if it's false, it'll fires whatever is right here. So if it's true, we want to do current theme plus or equal to 1, and if it's false, we want to set it back to 0. Alright, let's get rid of these brackets. We didn't need more than one line of code. This should all be set up now. Let's go through it to make sure we have this set up. We have our grid manager set up, the tile theme object, and the cell. So going back into Unity, we can set up the scriptable object that we created earlier. Click on your grid manager. You'll see that you have an array of themes now. We'll go back to our scene, or our assets, my bad. Create a new folder to store your scriptable object, or we'll call it themes. We'll store our themes in a theme folder. Create tiles theme. We'll call this one forest. And on here, we need to use the forest sprites that we brought in before. We should really make a graphics folder to store our graphics also. We can delete the square that we are using in the previous video. Going into our themes, select forest, go into graphics, click the down arrow on the tile sheet, increase the size, drag in your forest tiles, making sure to follow the order that we set up before, which is top left, top middle, top right, middle left, middle middle, middle right, bottom left, bottom middle, bottom right. So we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We need our bottom row. Now that we have the forest set up, we can go ahead and make the forest in the theme area. Just drag and drop it in here. Let's create a new theme. We'll call this one desert. Put in the desert tiles. And we also have water tiles, so we can go ahead and set up a water theme also. Go ahead and put all 3 of your themes onto your grid manager. We have our 3 themes. The first theme will be 0, so 4 should be our first theme element. If we click space, it'll switch to desert. Click space again, and it switches to water. Click space again, and it goes back to the first element. If you go to your main camera, change your size to 50, we'll go ahead and just pump that baby straight to 50. And now you can see you have a huge grid. That's it for this video. Join me next time to find out how to place foliage onto each tile I believe we'll just use a random range, but you could think of any logic you want to. We'll use another scriptable object to store the foliage, and we can actually set up a height of that object. Say it's a flower, that height would maybe be like 0.5. If it's a wall or a rock or a tree, its height would be 1. So you could then access the height of that scriptable object's decoration or foliage to then use it in your pathfinding to make sure you can't walk over certain sprites. But that'll be later down the road. Join me next time to figure out how to place the foliage. Have a wonderful day. Hopefully you'll see me next time in the next video.